Good morning, everyone. We are again live at Giriz Adda, and we have a very special guest. Before we get to him, let me say a few things about Giriz Adda and get us all started. So, this is the 89th episode at the Adda, and I would like to begin by thanking all of you for the support that you have provided over the last couple of years into making the space a lot more vibrant, a lot more active, and so on. So when I say 89th episode, I include everything in it. I include the songs that I sing, the book reviews that have been done, and of course, the most important part is the conversations that we have at the Adda. We just finished a very interesting conversation some time back with Girish Menon, another old colleague and friend who's done some remarkable work over the years. But today we have, for me, Sony is an old friend, a colleague, a very dear friend, and we go back a long time. And I have been pursuing with Sony for the last few weeks in to get him into this space and talk to us about his very rich, insightful, and amazing journey as a child rights activist. So before I dive into the questions, with Sony, I would like to say a few things about him. So for me, Sony is one of the very few activists who works on child rights in the country. He has put in more than 3 decades of experience, 3 decades of work. Uh, and what is unique about the work that Sony has done is that he has engaged, he has soiled his hands, he has worked in communities across the country, talking to parents, children, teachers, community members, and so on. And at the same time, he is equally comfortable in the, you know, in the space of policy making with governments, both at the center and state level. And I think that's a very unique combination which many cannot boast about. So that's the first thing that I would like to say. He's been a big champion for child rights over the years, working with individuals, mentoring organizations, individuals, networks, and so on. And child rights, as we will discover in our conversation today with Sony, is an area which cuts across everything that society does, which cuts across everything that government does. So in his work, Sony has extensively worked with various government departments, be it education, women and child welfare, tribal development. I mean, you name it, there has been an engagement. And at the same time, he's also worked very closely with another very crucial pillar of child rights, which is the judiciary. He's had some very interesting experiences working with the judiciary and with the police as well. So we are hoping that some of these experiences will come to the fore today, and I'm fondly hoping that people who are interested in children, child rights in general, and maybe within their own domains such as education and so on, will all tune in and learn from what Sony has to say. So with that, Sony, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you for finally accepting this request to be part of the ADA. You are muted,
Uh,
so you'll have to unmute.
no, I'm. Thank you so much, Giri, for all the good words, and happy and proud to be at Giriz Adda, and look forward to an enriching experience mutually, Giri.
Thank you so much, Sony. So I would like to begin, as is usually the case, with a little bit of history. And I suspect, Sony, that when you began your journey, um when did you actually begin your journey in what we call as the development sector? Which year was that, if you remember?
1986.
19.
1986.
Okay. So in 1986, Sony, this whole term called child rights, which we use, so commonly today and which we take for granted almost, was it around at that time? I mean, was there any
Uh,
concept of child rights at all?
not Giri, exactly not as child rights at that point in time. Even though
Mhm.
we had in 1959, you had the UN Declaration on Child Rights. So you
Okay.
had the Declaration on Child Rights which had come in. And
Hmm.
more than child rights discussion, it was the human rights declaration which was actually discussed more at that point in time. And the
Right.
intervention on child rights were mostly in areas of child labor and, looking at some of those issues which were existent at that time. So
Hmm. Hmm.
if you really look at in legislative terms, 1986, you had the Child Labor Act, the Juvenile Justice Act, everything which came in 1986. So
Hmm.
that was a time there was a certain amount of discussion, though
Hmm.
not centrally fully on child rights, but on 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 a
On
lot of
children, basically.
on
Yeah.
children per se, and the kind of work that needed to be done.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think 1986 also saw the drafting of that of the previous national policy on education. So that had a lot of
education. Yeah,
things in
yes,
education, and of course we had prior to that we had the ICDS program around 1970
early
four
childhood one.
1975, which was again focused on children. But then I think possibly it was 1989 that the Child Rights Convention came into force, and many
Right.
countries then went around ratifying it. So that's an amazing. I mean, that's such a long and vast trajectory that you've had within child rights, working with. I mean, I remember our paths. In fact, for those colleagues who have tuned in and friends, our paths crossed sometime in 2000 2001, and I do remember Sony playing a huge role in Cry as a child rights activist. So Cry was a very important organization with its networks that and they were talking specifically, probably the only organization that was so vocal about child rights at that point of time, more than 20 25 years ago. Sony then
I
also
agree.
moved on to Plan. He spent a few years there. That's where our paths crossed. And after that, he's been, of course, working with UNICEF and so on. You were saying something, Sony.
No, Giri, I think when you are discussing child rights, it's also important to note that CRI was started in 1979. That was the international.
79.
Yeah, that
Wow.
was the International Year for Children. So,
Okay.
uh,
Okay.
20 years after the UN declaration. So, though it was child relief and you at that point in time, and later change of name
Then
came as
child
child
rights
rights.
and you.
Yeah, so
Ah,
that actually talks about the transition. The first question you asked about, like, child rights as a
right.
discussion, and this one came um, uh, in 1992. India ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, but then
Right.
1989 the CRC came into force, and then India ratified it in 1989, 1992 with a Article 32, which were dealing with child labor. We had said
Okay.
a certain amount of reservation that it required time and resources to look at that. But I think it's also important that the discussion internally in India
Hmm.
was around the early 90s. The whole discussion on child rights happened, and it
Right.
was the same time then we had the campaign against child labor, trying to
Mhm.
as a campaign body, trying to bring people around and to look at it. So that I think is also quite important that we consider at that
Yeah,
point in time.
CACL, I think, is an important milestone in the civil society space, which brings me to a related question, Sony, and that is, can you help us understand the key milestones? I mean, you've already started responding to that in a way. What are the key milestones in that long journey around child rights in India? How do you see that?
See, I think we must actually really start looking at the whole discussion from point of view of the whole positioning of child rights in the constitution.
Okay.
The constitution itself articulated the child rights centeredness for the necessity to look at education, look at healthcare, looking at nutrition, looking at special care for children. So that positioning was something of a reality in India. So I think the roots of rights-based positioning of children uh,
Hmm.
happened there. And if you really look at it, even before the UN convention, the kind of things that happened. I mean, I think we must go back to the 1927 Children's Aid Society of Mumbai, where
Okay.
the work on focused on children and especially orphan children. Globally, the work on child rights started with looking at orphan children, war orphans, and
Mhm.
everything,
Mhm.
including
Mhm.
UNICEF. Everyone started with children in emergencies, and that way, with the Children's Aid Society in 1921 and in 19 no 27, we had the Guild of Services, and then you had the Indian Council for Child Welfare, ICCW, things
Okay.
which happened in much between 1920 and 1950, which was actually
Okay.
something that brought children into focus, and even issues like crash programs and Central Social
Okay.
Welfare Board, and there was a lot of focus that came in on issues relating to children, and that was
Right.
the first thing. And 1979, as I said, cry came into existence, and then as you know, Save the Children had played a critical role globally in terms of the
Yes.
articulation of child rights and how it got into this one. And I think we really need to the changing moments in India for a lot of discussion on child rights came with 1986, the Child Labor Act, Juvenile Justice Act, and education policy. That was a policy time, and
Mm.
that has been something which has been a critical point in terms of early initiation of the rights discussion, and the action at the field level started with that. And I
Yeah.
also, if you really go back
Just
to the
one interjection here, which is it's very interesting because you just mentioned that many international agencies, including Save the Children, which has of course championed child rights across the world. The organization that we work for, Plan started in 1937 in the context of the Spanish Civil War, and I think, like you rightly said, probably this whole focus on children has a very deep emergency connect somewhere. Children in adversity, children who were losing their parents, children who were displaced, and facing a lot of violence as a result, and so on. Even UNICEF, the earlier acronym of UNICEF was Children's Emergency Fund, and later on, it became Children's
children's
Fund.
fund.
So I think that's a very interesting, yeah, yeah. Please carry on from where you
Yeah,
left.
no,
Yeah.
I think it's a basically, if you I mean, when you're looking at child rights history in India, like for example, it was in 1990 that the juvenile justice guidelines, global guidelines came, but before that, you already
Hmm.
had in 1986 itself the legislation. And
Hmm.
if you really look at the kind of actions that happened in India,
Hmm.
I think the we were a lot ahead in action. Like for example, the Sarada Act on child marriage is more than 100 years old. So
Ah, okay.
in terms of social reform, and I think the whole in terms of special focus to children in social reform,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
in positioning child welfare, there
Hmm.
has been a lot of uh, forward action in the country, and that is where I said even the constitution. So the constitution itself articulated child so well that even your right to education came from that positioning.
From that, yeah,
And
Article
yeah,
21,
yeah,
21A,
Article
yeah,
21, which actually got into 83rd Amendment, and how. But I think
right.
it is not the 83rd Amendment, and the whole right to education was already made a right because of a
Mhm.
Supreme Court intervention.
Mm,
And
mm,
you
mm.
had soft law, which actually, before the hard law came, you would see that the judicial interventions had made a lot of these things possible.
Possible,
And
yeah.
yeah, and if you really look at the 80s, something very interesting in the country, like the post emergency scenario where the revival of human rights movements, basically People's Union for Civil Liberties, and the whole debate on child rights, the whole position given to public interest litigation by the
Right.
judiciary, all these created the space for interventions on areas relating to child rights.
So
and
that
and
brings
and
us to this question of the role that civil society or people's movements have played. So can you tell us a little on that? I mean, like you've outlined a series of milestones, in terms of what government has done, uh, and of course continues to do till this day. But what do you think was the role of civil society organizations, individuals within civil society, and so on, to kind of push this debate?
There were two situations
Hmm.
in civil society interventions. The
Okay.
one was you had the Indian Council for Child Welfare (ICCW), which was actually um, uh, semi-governmental or wives of people or VV Giri, Mohini Giri, and there are people who actually led these movements and who were connected with either their husbands were in politics or people who were in higher positions and this one. So there was a policy influencing which was happening naturally in terms of like what we did for children. And the second, what we really talk about the organized campaign modes of action by civil society. I think the most important one, as always, has been campaign against child labor, which from
Okay.
early 90s has brought the maximum number of civil society organizations on a platform and
Hmm.
did really use the ILO conventions and the positioning on children, child labor, using constitution and other legislative frameworks, try to push the agenda at one level. The same thing
Hmm.
happened with child trafficking. A campaign against child
Hmm.
trafficking also was in the mid 90s, where organizations like HUC really played a lead role and then came into this one. But I think the role played by TDS Germany, UNICEF, National Foundation of India, UA in Mumbai, these were
Okay.
these were the organizations which played a very critical role in this campaign and giving shape to a lot of focus on bringing people together. I think we
Hmm.
should also not um, uh, count the Bachwan Bachao Andolan or the Swami Agniveshas and people who brought in a very different kind of work also on child rights coming from Priya Rajesh, and then they were all management gurus who came into the development sector, and they positioned children and participation in a different light. Within the same light, in global movements against child labor, like
Hmm.
Bachwan Bachao, you had the concern for working children in Bangalore, which was
Bangalore. Yes.
the one organization which really pushed the globally the agenda of child labor. And then
Right.
simultaneously, the whole these discussions about banning of products of child labor and all that was happening. And the 90s was a lot of action
Very
of
active. Yeah.
civil society groups which really formed into a lot of action. And I think if you really look at the kind of groups that in the 90s,
Hmm.
civil society groups on the trafficking, child labor, lot of work on child abuse and child protection. I mean, like, Tulir in Chennai, Unfold in Bangalore, Shaktivani in Delhi, Sini and others who came together also to really look at other issues relating to children. But the whole positioning of all these movements of children for children, you would see they were all issue specific. So you had
Mm.
mobile crashes, which actually brought in a lot of convergence around early childhood
Young
education.
child.
Yeah, at young child and need to like rights of construction workers and need for this one and the national crash program in Delhi and all that programmatically you had a something
Right.
that came. In the similar way, I think something which was very important is in May 1998 you had the uh, National Alliance for Fundamental Right to Education, NAFRE.
Nafre,
Yeah,
yes.
it was actually it was UNICEF, National Foundation of India, CRY, who were the lead. Pratham at that time was actually in their initial years, were coming in a big way into action in that period. So you would see the 90s and the mid 90s, we had things like that which were very, very different from the previous experiences. And you had
Mm-hmm.
parallelly human rights bodies, you had Dalit rights interventions, human rights education, child rights education in schools, and things like
Mm-hmm.
that emerged in terms of the whole discussion centered around child rights gained momentum in the 90s. And that
Right.
is a and by late 90s, I think it had matured to a very, very large extent. And if you
Mm.
really look at people like Concern for Working Children, really focused on participation and
Right.
certain rights of children, which were really necessary, and they were global learning centers in terms of how we in positioning the child rights movement. CWC was considered for Nobel Prize 3 times for their work
Oh,
on participation.
this is
And
news. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, and then it was like 2014 that Kailash Satyarthi was got the Nobel Prize. But I think the consideration for child rights work, and also I think the global march by Bachwan Bachao Andolan, and the global march led by Kailash Satyarthi was something which made the issue more global.
More
and
global.
and
Wonderful.
and
Yeah.
and in the 90s you had a lot of support for child rights work, especially from Netherlands agencies from Netherlands and the US. Primarily they promoted a lot of work on that. So
Mm.
that was availability of resources, the emergence of centers like Center for Child and the Law in National Law School, and the emergence of such specialized agencies were also
Yes.
like it happened in the 90s. So if you really ask me, the thick of action on child rights in India
Mm-hmm.
happened in the 90s. And in
Mm.
the new millennium, like you would see the right to Education Act and POXO and legislations which have
Mm-hmm.
happened in terms of this one. But I think the critical thing, I would like to differentiate two things.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the big thing in India is we have moved beyond many others in terms of child rights, because
Okay.
in many places where child right is seen as basically protecting children and legislation to protect children,
Mm.
uh, which is the whole realm of child protection, which
Mm.
children get protected through formulation of legislations. Globally,
Mm.
that is one area which is the a very prominent area of action, legal
Right
action.
now.
And
Yes.
um,
Yes.
and and what happened in India, we have moved to making right to education, right to health, right to nutrition, which becomes justiciable because you have these rights already enshrined in the constitution and legislative wise. So
Legislation. Yeah. Okay. So
yeah,
it's
so
much more broader, you're saying. Okay.
it is actually in positioning. We are
Mm.
much more uh, proactive in terms of having many of these provisions which were
Mm.
from a
Mm.
welfare provision status of the state to something
Right.
which is
Right.
justiciable and demand.
Right.
Yes, and that shift is something which is phenomenal in terms of the real movement.
Okay,
Yes, Giri.
wonderful. I think this history is fascinating, and I'm not sure if somebody has actually sat down to write it, and maybe we need to actually write it down, because I'm sure people working for children in whichever area they're working in and wherever they're working would find this extremely interesting. I think this is very, very useful, Sony. There are so many things happening in my mind, questions that come up. One thing is, of course, I remember child concern for working children talk about child protagonism. I think that's how they
Right,
called it.
right,
This whole area of children participating and actively
right.
participating in decisions that affect what happens to them. Right. I'll just take a pause and kind of step back and remind all of us that when we talk of child rights, we are talking of how well do our societies treat their children. I think broadly, do they respect children's dignities? Are children provided opportunities for growth, for development, and like Sony was saying, our children protected from the many dangers that lurk in their everyday life. So child rights is really a vast kind of area that spans, of course. I don't want to get into a more formal definition of it, but then we also talk about uh, the right to survival, growth, development, and participation. I think this is how the Child Rights Convention has probably, defined child rights. There is a question from a colleague in Chhattisgarh, Sony, Snehil Rathod, and thank you, Snehil, for that question. I'll just take a few questions, from people, and she asks, where do you see the role of course curriculum of state and central boards in sensitizing and empowering children for exercising their rights, and how well do you think it is being addressed? So you can either choose to respond to that now, or you can take it up later. And there are a few, in fact, Swagata Raha, mentions this statement. It's not a question. She says, this perspective on the history of the child rights movement needs to be documented. I think, Sony, you've really got people thinking about that very, very interesting and fascinating history. Thank you so much for that. But then, do you want to respond quickly to Snehil Rathod's question?
I actually, yes, Neil, I think one of the things which we have in terms of making child rights a reality in this country, I think we have not demystified child rights.
Mm-hmm.
Child rights has to be remystified. Child rights is all about dignity of children.
Mm-hmm.
And what actually happens is, like, any instance of abuse, any instance of poverty, any instance of exploitation, exclusion, it brings the dignity of the child down. And in a situation where the overall scenario is not conducive, the dignity child feels de-dignified. And that is something of a personal experience of a child. And the only way that it can be reversed is through processes of participation, where you actively listen to children, give them the space, give them the decision making, and they get themselves out of this. And this understanding of the actually the treatment for a whole lot of issues that arrive out of de-dignifying experiences for children happens through the processes of empowerment, which happens through child participation.
Mm-hmm.
And unless we are able to give this concept of participation a real life experience, and because the problem is in today's India or in Indian cultural context, children are seen as properties of families. They are not becoming part of a discussion. They are not able to be part of discussions. Their disciplining is primarily through violence. So when you are not able to push the agenda of um, peace and non-violence as a way of discipline, it is very difficult to be talking about child protection.
Mm-hmm.
So there needs to be experiences which we are able to build. And that is where I think what Sendil was talking about, the course curriculum, and how do we really look at child rights in real experiences in the classrooms. How do we
Educational
really
settings. Yeah.
educate settings? This becomes a very big challenge. Not just
Mhm.
how does it start from very small time to very small age. How do you promote children to ask questions? For example, where questioning and challenging or having a difference of view is seen as a value rather than something where one needs to feel threatened. So I think there needs to be a repositioning. And when you talk about the I mean, when I try to explain child rights, I always say UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has got only 54 articles. It's like a pack of cards. 52 and then two jokers, which would be the primary best interest of the child and the non-discrimination principles, which are very fundamental, which needs to be going with everyone. And the four
Mm-hmm.
bundles of rights are like the clubs, dice, and cards, which is survival is not one right. It is a cluster of rights. It is a group
Right.
of rights like dice or anything. So how do you really make it known to people that these things are necessary. And if you really look at survival rights, it is more of physical quotient of the child, where you are
Yeah.
looking at education, and I mean, you're looking at nutrition, healthcare, sanitation, basic facilities, which are necessary for your physical quotient. And if you really look at what needs to be done for your brain, your intellectual quotient happens through the whole action on development of education. And
Right.
the right to education covers those issues which are more related to that. And your social quotient gets covered in what you call the participation right. So
Right.
you're
I
the
think
way that, yeah, yeah,
no, no.
please
What
go
I
ahead.
was saying is, I mean, one response to what Snehil, the question Snehil has asked, is this whole, I think, worryingly today, for somebody like me who's in the education space, we are talking a lot more about what we call as learning outcomes. We are
Yeah,
not talking about what what goes inside the classroom. For example, in processes of teaching and learning, are children actively participating there? I mean, a very simple indicator for me, Snehil, would be, are children allowed to ask questions? I think this is something that Sony was also referring to. And a lot of micro level studies, and there isn't enough on this. I mean, we don't know exactly what happens inside the school and the classroom, and we know even less about what happens inside communities and families. I think that's another area that we many of these classroom studies show that there isn't simply enough questioning both sides. There isn't simply enough of a conversation that happens. It's very didactic, it's very
yeah.
teacher driven still. And I know it's a very sad thing that, we've been talking of educational reforms for so many decades now, but we are still coming back to those fundamental questions. Let's move
No,
on.
no, no, Giri, I needed to add to something. I
Yes, yes.
think my experience of that kind of an education process, mm, paying tributes to Miss Mary Roy, who passed away day before yesterday, in terms of visioning education, where the whole child-centered processes, where experiential learning was promoted through her. I had an opportunity to visit her school in 1985 and 86, and did sessions with the children and took them out for exposure to slum life and a lot of things which happened around that. And I think
Mhm.
we do have a lot of people who have promoted these islands of excellence in education. You take the
Mm.
CLR, you take the Hyderabad Center for Learning. We have everybody who is done Vikramshila in yeah. You have centers of excellence, but it is not becoming part of and this leads us to the big challenge in education today. How
Mm.
many of our teachers are trained on human rights and child rights? How do they know,
Mm.
like, what does it mean, what does child participation mean in the whole realm of learning experiences? So
Absolutely, absolutely.
how do we reposition these needs to be the way forward and the challenge. And I think uh, the good starting point is to look at some of these classroom transactions which might happen on centered on child rights. But then what happened is, like, you included child marriage as an issue, child labor as an issue. You are not
Yeah.
talking about, you're not,
Silos.
yes, you are not looking at child rights and what does it mean to be
Yeah.
introduced at various levels. So yeah, that I think, Senthil,
I
thank
think
you for that question.
many state governments, and I'm sure those of you who are watching will agree that there is no textbook in this country today, I think, that does not have some chapter or the other to deal with child rights. But then, like you said, it's more in the nature of information sharing, and not so much, designed to deepen, that element of participation and questioning, and agreeing to, accept different views, and and also it's not very contextual. I think that's where we need to move. But then that's all of that is intimately related to how we prepare our teachers and the challenges that come in at that point of time. uh, One question, Sony, and I'm trying to move forward. There's a lot that uh, I mean, this is a pretty sensitive question. Do you think the government is And I'm not, when I say the government, I'm not just talking of either the center or the state or whatever. There are all these legislations, and you have yourself said that India has positioned, as a state, India has positioned this very, very differently and perhaps more progressively. But then, is there the seriousness that is required to make child rights happen? No, making laws is one thing, but then, and that signals an intent. But then, is that enough?
Um, I very well, I must say that uh, in terms of policies and legislations, we are at 90 plus in terms of global, I would say 90 plus rating. But in terms of implementation, I think we are at 35, maybe barely touching a pass mark
Really passing.
situation. Yeah, making a pass mark. But let me come to the challenge. I think there is a um, campaign. There is Nine is Mine campaign. Nine is Mine is like a campaign for allocation of 9% of resources for children. Yeah,
Hmm.
and that is a and I think that is where the challenge lies. We are making ornamental increases to the budgets, and
Okay.
the monitoring of the utilization of resources is not happening.
Okay. Okay.
90% of the additional resources go into hardware, either buildings or machinery, like health equipment, this one, and it is not really moving towards what needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for
Mm-hmm.
example, everybody will tell you the problems in health, in primary health care, not
Mm.
medical in nature. It is more of people's awareness and action, like, how do you care, how parental education happens, how they are able to give that early childhood
Mm-hmm.
care and nurture to the child. But then our investment in that realms are not monitored. What
Mm.
gets
Mm.
monitored is number of Anganwadi centers built, or what is the this one. What really intersects at the community level, we are not monitoring, and this I think is one this one. The second is you
So
can
you're
have
saying, just 1 minute. So you're saying two things. One is allocation of adequate
resource.
resources that continues to be a problem in India in 2022. That's what you're saying. And
Yes,
then you're saying that we are not monitoring the most fundamental or important things that need to be monitored. I mean, we are probably just scratching the surface, because yeah, infrastructure may be important, but then that is not the only thing that is needed. And probably you can see reflections of all of these in different domains, whether it's schools or health centers or
education,
whatever it
health. Yeah, you look at from DPP times till now in education, for example, with the new
is. Hmm.
education policy, these ones,
Hmm.
the resource allocations have increased.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
what is been the real thing that moved down to the children directly? How much
Hmm.
went into infrastructure and what resources are getting covered at what level is something which requires a closer look, and that is where I think we are not making real progress. The second,
Hmm.
we have the best of legislations in NCPCR
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
2006, National Commission for which who is supposed to be doing this work, and the
Right.
national and state commissions are there. But
Right.
in terms of resource allocation and in terms of giving, your commissions come in and go, and there is a there needs to be a scaffolding on which there is these things work. You need an infrastructure, you need a team of researchers, you need people who really do the, like the bureaucracy supports the system, the
Hmm. Hmm.
legislature. You need a permanent bureaucracy kind of a setup which will be
For
adding
child.
value to the whole. Yes, in terms, and that is not happening in terms of resource allocation. That kind of a long term planning is not happening. This I
So you're
think is,
saying you're not having a dedicated workforce or human resources that looks into child rights, that cuts across, all aspects of governance. Is that what you're saying?
yes, yeah,
And I think I remember in an earlier conversation with you, you were lamenting the fact that the other day that even a scheme like the Integrated Child Protection Scheme, the ICPS, does not have full-time staff. I mean, you have most of them on either contracts or deputation, or I mean, it's a very temporary kind of situation, and that I think is a bit of a paradox, because it also therefore signals that while the intent is there, it is not being taken seriously enough to make it happen. And I think both the center and the state governments really need to sit down to talk about this in terms of making it happen.
Giri, I think there are two dimensions to this.
Yeah.
The first dimension is you are seeing staff cost reliability, and
Hmm.
therefore you are the all new appointments you say needs to be in terms of like only contractual for 3 to 5 years, and then you so that the benefits are not given to them of pension and other things and this one. Where the resources are not commensurate with the running of such projects or such programs, there is a challenge. I really understand this, but we
Hmm.
are not going to the drawing board and looking at what can be the service conditions that even if I am coming in as a contract staff, how can
Hmm.
you make
Hmm.
sure that I continue my services for 10 years or 20 years,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
there is an increment given, and there is at least a semblance of a cadre which is built, and
Hmm.
where you need to look at your labor laws, you need to look at certain reforms in the labor laws,
Hmm.
and we have changed so much the globalization process, and what happened in the 2000s primarily is that we have had so much of change, but we are not changing the foundations which need to be changed. So
Hmm.
the challenges, you are making everything which is like becoming very fragmented, and this is a challenge which requires political commitment and an
Hmm.
understanding where you are able to like draw up those frameworks which are national in nature, which would facilitate this one. I mean, I would say
Right.
child protection workforce in this country, 95% are outsourced and 5% is the core this one. And for
Yeah.
any system to work, you need, like, for example, education or health has got 95% uh, regular staff, government staff, and then 5% is contractual. You need
Right.
something of that sort to make something functional. And this is
Right.
on in terms of child rights, in terms of how do we look at this. I think the reforms need to be at various levels coming together. Yeah, so sorry
Right.
for cutting in, Giri. Yeah.
No, 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 not at all. I think that's a very useful point that you're making, and those are amongst the challenges. But going to come back to the challenges later. Sony, I'm going to bring in somebody who is familiar with your work and who wants to ask you a few questions. I'm going to get him into the studio. Just give me a minute. Uh, Lolichan, are you there? Can you hear us? Yes. Good morning, Sony.
Yes,
So you
very
Good
have
to
good
see
morning.
you.
Such a
so
pleasure to meet both of you.
Thank you
thank you,
so
Loli,
much.
for
Let's.
so for our viewers, Loli Chen is works in the domain of child protection. He's a child protection officer working with UNICEF. He's been with UNICEF for a long time, and more importantly, he's been within the domain of child rights for a very long time. And I think so, Loli. The floor is yours. The focus is on Sony, of course. What is it that you want to, and you may have been hearing part of our conversation so far, so are there any things that you want to share, you want to ask Sony as we move forward in this conversation?
It's been such a rich conversation, and for me to intrude and dissect your conversation doesn't seem to be fair. Am I audible?
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
However, Sony and Giri, it's such a pleasure to be with you. And when this conversation was kind of circulated in various networks, someone commented one maestro with another. And I thought it was
Oh god.
indeed very true. Somebody in education, somebody in child rights for so many years of work. Sony, 36 years of work in the area of child rights, not a joke. Tremendous amount of
Absolutely.
work at various levels, as Giri said in the beginning, soiling your hands at the ground level to policymakers, to systems at the national and international levels. Tell us two things of from a system point of view.
Two of your pain points, I hope.
Yes, which you will enjoy. What have been
Yes.
your one high and one low from a system point of view as a child rights professional?
Okay, so you've taken away that question from me, but then I'm happy you're asking Sony that.
Mm,
Yeah, the highs and lows. So come on, what has been the most frustrating moment for you, and what has been the most exhilarating, exciting, satisfying moment that you've had in 36 years? I know you need to really scratch and go down memory lane, but then do it for us.
I think one of the laws which happened was like, the whole campaign for right to education, NAFRE, and we were into a big campaign trying to bring in 0 to 6 also under the 3 to 6 also as part of the right to education. This one. And I remember we had a lot of collaboration with mobile crashers, the whole network about this, and we had such amount of work that happened. And I remember we had a signature campaign which I was spearheading, and we had over 4.5 lakhs of postcards signed by individuals being given to the MPs at that point in time, looking for inclusion of 3 to 6 as part of the campaign. And outright no from the human resources minister at that point in time, when we were in a personal meeting, he said nothing doing, it won't happen, you don't need to make any noise. And not even willing to discuss this one was something which I thought was quite painful, and I feel equally
Why
excited that
was that Sony? I mean, was it because they didn't have the
um,
money, or they didn't believe in it? What do you think was the
no, I
reason for
don't think it was the reason of the money, because ICDS and you had the resources which you could actually appropriate into making that a reality. But I think the thinking at that point in time was, you only had to look at 6 to 14, and it was more of a protective nature, and you wanted to play it pretty safe, because this was one of the first instances. This happened much before the act came into being, and therefore that debate at that point in time, the understanding, political buy-in did not happen adequately. Now already hearing that 3 to 6 you want, is the right to education and movement. So I think that's been one of those real
Difficult moments.
at that point in time, it was difficult to reconcile. Right now, when I look back, I think we should have been ready with a let off point at some time, and give and take relations, and how do we really do that advocacy negotiation is something. Um,
Mhm.
the high. How do I say the high? I mean, like, uh,
Many highs, right?
no, many, not many highs. Let's say it like, ICPS, for example. The whole ICPS happened from nothingness. There was a joint secretary, Loveleen Kakkar, who believed that you needed, because the WCD ministry was just formed, and social from Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, and you had come into existence, and she saw an opportunity to look at something like ICDS in child protection. So she
Okay.
said, like, let us work on this. And she would tell me, like, Sony, you going to sit in my office, and make sure that I sat in the office and we were working together. And the whole concept of ICPS, it came from nothingness. I think Inachi and the Hug team, there was Nicole from Childline at that point in time, and Parvation from World Bank now. uh, the way that we were able to move from nothingness to conceiving a scheme and making it happen at that point in time was for me a high, because that was you did not have anything, you didn't. And the strategic error that happened is that you had conceived everybody there as outsourced staff, and you saw it as a scheme. And because that was the only thing that would sell in government at that point in time, you could only look at a scheme, you couldn't look at regular staff or anything. And therefore, and I also believe that the what we proposed and what came in at the end of it was like, the salaries were cut by 1/3. We had positioned it much higher in stature and this one. So what? And there is a disappointment in that. And also we had really said that there needs to be an increment. Like, you need to look at, for institutions, childcare institutions, the money should come down, and the sponsorship and foster care money should go up. Like, on a 10-year, we should actually be able to get at a 60-40 level or something. These were discussed and agreed upon, but then what happens is the people move once the scheme
No, but
came
this
into
Yeah,
also takes me back, Sony, to a much earlier scheme, which still remains a scheme of of sorts, which is the ICDS.
right.
Now, on the one hand, you have global agencies, including the government of India. You see the kind of importance that NEP 2020 now accords for young children, but ICDS Anganwadi workers are not considered as staff. They still continue to be disproportionately paid much lower than teachers, much
Right.
lower, in fact. But then we pay lip service to the idea that the early years are the most crucial. So I think there are these very
dichotomies.
fundamental issues, and perhaps
Now,
there's this insecurity that if we make them staff, we are going to have more problems, because they will unionize, they will create more issues, and so on and so forth. So probably the same logic is
no,
underpinning the
Giri, let me just come in for a minute. If I were the decision maker for a day, the one thing which I would decide is on the kind of investment we make on 3 to 6 or 0 to 6 age group. If
Mm.
95% of your brain development happens, and
exactly.
we as a country live in worker or the caregivers or the nannies for those who can afford the whole work with the young child, I would rewrite the whole investment and how we look at the younger cohort as an investment opportunity. And I would say that is an investment and not an expenditure. And this is where the reversal of the process from higher education to the lower education, I would really reverse the scene. And that's, yeah, yes, Loli, yeah. So I think these two are, like, you would see the high is also equally the low in terms of
Yeah,
ICPS,
but
in
yet,
experience.
Tony, that was a gain. Though it's a partial gain, it was a big gain, and we've moved on and we built on over the years with ICPS there. So only coming back, Giri, to for you to know that in our own circles, Sony
Hmm.
is known as a role model and a big practitioner.
Of course,
You
yeah.
you traversed on various aspects of child rights, and one of the areas that I really passionate about is this entire area of child participation and child rights, and how do you bring that into one's own lives, you know,
Hmm.
from moving from profession to personal. So I'm moving away from the technical aspects of child protection, child rights. So Sony, when you look at your own life, and I'm sure there are many child rights practitioners, budding social workers listening to us. How do you see this move from a professional space when we speak about child rights, child participation, values, principles, into actual practice in one's own life? How challenging and how easy it is?
Very interesting question, actually.
Uh, Thank you so much. Some of the most painful experiences in life, in terms of how did you look after your children.
Yes.
When my children were small, that was a time when you are struggling with your career also.
Yeah.
And I think one of the compromises that we made was, like, my wife remained a housewife, and she said, "I will look after the children," so that we kind of had an understanding. And I remember she would mark the days which I am on travel on the
Calendar.
calendar and show it to my bosses. Like, you are talking about child rights, and see, this is what you do to your staff. And which I thought was a very powerful advocacy in terms of, like, on how we see. But I think the real challenge is the humility to listen to children and
Hmm.
to see any decision. Um, how do they define what you do?
Hmm.
Mm.
And this, I think, is an empowerment process as an individual
Mm-hmm.
and an empowerment for the children.
Right.
Now, this is basically a lot of de-learning has to happen in our construct, in our mental framework. If we have to
Mm-hmm.
position child rights and child participation in our lives, the journey is a lot of de-learning and depositioning,
Mm.
because you have to move from being a teacher to be a
Mm.
facilitator and a mentor.
Mm.
And that movement is it's a big shift where you become a
Right.
co-learner and you
Yeah.
become part of the journey. And for me, I think those were the aha moments in life. I remember people like um, Anil Chaudhary of Priya, Kalyani, people who gave us the skills. Vasudeva Sharma of CRT, me, we were all like mentored onto understanding mentoring. How do you see the differences? How do you accept differences? How do you live with difficulties? How do you? And
Mm.
this is this journey, I think, is missing today. This
Mm. Mm.
investment in people, we are no more into. We are not investing in uh, in our workforce. Child
Mm.
rights
Mm.
biggest problem is we are having training programs, we are having touch and go programs, knowledge impartment, but I think there needs to be a much longer and larger investment. Hats off to organizations like Cry, which is really invested. When my salary was 2000, they have spent 2 lakhs for 10 days training on me.
Mm.
My
Wow.
salary was like 2 or 3000 then. But that is the investment which is required to get us into a different mode. I think that is where we are missing, and the whole pressure is on outputs and
Yeah.
show
Yeah.
show results, and not in investing in people. And
I
when we
think
are
Loli,
talking about,
yeah, the sad thing, I mean, completely echo with what Sony is saying. I think we are probably running a rat race in terms of doing
Numbers.
things, numbers, and okay,
Numbers.
this training has to be done, that has to be done. And now with digital, platforms coming in a big way, I think we are all getting doubly stressed because you're sitting in a car or you're sitting in your you're going somewhere. Suddenly, you'll have to log into a
Come
meeting,
on.
right?
Mm.
Those were the old golden days where everything had its time, and you could think
And
of things probably in a much more deeper manner. Now
and
you're
the
just
human
skimming.
touch.
Yeah, you're
And the
skimming the
human touch.
stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely, the human touch part of it. Yeah, yeah. There's
Right.
one question which I forgot to take up. I think this is something that both of you can reflect on. Uh, and there's a question by Pradeep Kumar from an organization called World Reader. He asks this question: please suggest how digital access can empower children's right to participation. I think it's a very interesting question. Starting with you, Sony, and Loli, can you both reflect on this? I mean, we look at this
mm,
both as a, I mean, digitalization of our lives, both as a problem, but also as an opportunity. So here, of course, one needs to look at how is it that children can. I remember, I mean, just to kind of kickstart this, 1098 was probably a very, very important, and I think it was a paradigm shift. 1098 could be dialed by a child in
Right.
distress, and you could hope for a response. And I think there are thousands of examples of where that succeeded and how so many children were saved at that point of time. But then we have gone much beyond 1098 now. Today we have, even in rural areas, even in families that are struggling socio-economically, there is a digital device. So is that going to help empower children? Is that going to positively contribute to child rights? I think that's the sense of the question that I get.
yeah, Giri, I think there are two dimensions to. One is like my access to service and ability to report need for support. An
Hmm.
emergency outreach, a tool of this kind at your hand is something which facilitates easy access to something which can be reported, like as 1098 or that digital this one. But
Hmm.
the whole ball game of getting into definition of participation, the participation is not, I don't see you saying, you seeing something on the screen or putting an yes or putting a no as participation. And Lole will agree with me, the whole ladder of participation and what happens in this country in the name of participation today is a big challenge. And I do not fully agree that digital space is something that can give spaces for participation. Yes, you can. It actually helps us to reach out to a wider and excluded groups in some ways. But
Mhm.
as I told you, there needs to be a the participation process is it's a journey, and which requires a lot of education for the people who are promoting participation. And Loli would, I mean, the kind of work, hats off to him, the kind of work that they have done on participation and getting CWC to the level of being nominated for Nobel Peace Prize is something which is been very critical. And this, I think, is um, a challenging space, because a lot of this learning has to be hands on. A lot of experience of participation, the experience of empowerment and enablement needs to be, it cannot be digital. For me personally, I mean, I am an, maybe because of
It
my age and
cannot be only
only,
digital.
yeah, it
I
cannot
think that's
only be
also a
digital.
debate that we have in education in terms of how much can the digital medium really contribute. And I think it's important to recognize that it has limitations also. It's not a panacea for all our
Yeah.
ills. And it's very important for us practitioners to recognize where to draw the line and where to put the full stop. Loli, any thoughts on that question?
I do agree with both of you, but I really definitely think that the digital avenues that we have today will definitely enhance participation and engagement. For example, my children have such big connects with their kind of children across, not just within their school or within their network, but across the world. They are connected through the digital platforms and they are able to exchange ideas, share ideas. There is very good peer network, but that does not necessarily mean they are able to influence decision making processes. Now we also need to understand what is it that we mean when we say participation. Is it merely sharing ideas or having a good network, giving suggestions, etc.? But it
Mhm.
also means adding up to your ability to influence decisions and you are part of that decision making. Your voice is heard in the decisions. Now
Right.
that may not necessarily happen. You can have large consultative forums, etc. The same time to this gentleman who asked this question is that while we promote, and I think as organizations and individuals, we do promote digital literacy, digital empowerment, especially among children and adolescents. What we also need to take care of is the safety aspect, the risks that are involved in the extensive use of digital spaces by children, and therefore we should we should
That's
promote
it.
it, but
That's
we
a
also
huge
know the
area by
limits. Yeah,
itself. Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Wonderful. Um, Rajesh Nova, I think you will remember Sony, our old
Oh,
colleague
yes,
from
of course.
Plan Days.
Yes, sure.
He's on the session, and he's also reminding us that during our Plan Days we had this a framework called as the Child Centered Community Development. It was initially called child focused community development approach, then it became child centered community development approach, saying that this is something that we used to have a lot of discussion on those days. uh, we are coming very close to the end of this very interesting discussion. I wish we can go on, but in the interest of time, there's one question and I want to begin with Sony's response on that, and Loli, you could add your thoughts to it. Sony, 10 years from now, what would you want to see happening on child rights in India? What are some of the top things that you really want the government of the day to have done?
First, I would, as I said, resource allocation. 9 is mine a reality. Um, uh, the second, I actually uh, dream of a day when we are looking at child rights as child rights and not as, like, protecting children from abuse or where we are seeing all children having all rights, which is not like not in child labor or not being trafficked or extreme forms of violence. Yes, something which needs to be tackled. But how do we really look at in 10 years from now that every child has every right,
Mm-hmm.
which is um, the way that we think also need to change. I think all our programs, civil society programs and advocacy is segmented. We
Okay.
are looking at trafficking, we are looking at labor, somebody is looking at education, somebody is looking at malnutrition, somebody is looking at hand wash or wash facilities. In the same school, we have like eight different people reaching with eight different requirements, and
Absolutely.
there isn't a child rights perspective. What needs to be in terms of like how do we really look at it from point of view of intervention. So, how do we really break these barriers of this one and re-educate ourselves on what is it that we need to do and shared to kind of work together in civil society and in the system is one point. The resources is thirdly, I believe, as I said earlier, how do we become more accountable? Either
Okay.
allocation of resources is one factor, but where is the expenditure? What is the outcome? How do we really look at this outcome driven budgeting, and then how do we really look at what exactly is transferring? And for children, I believe that children need to be part and parcel of these decisions, and they need to be devising methods to tell us, like, is it working or not. I'm
Mm-hmm.
telling you, I believe we are not listening to children,
Mm-hmm.
and we really need to get back to listening to children, and they're telling us, like, what is it that is doing, what is it that is happening right, what can be done better, and that should be something that would guide us, and therefore relook at the way that we are engaging with children. That I would stop here and then.
Mm-hmm. But just a question to that. I mean, what comes to my mind is, uh, do you see uh, are you saying that we are moving in that direction, or are you lamenting that we are not moving enough?
I don't
The
think we
kind
are
of
moving
vision
in
that
that.
you're talking about, are we doing enough to get there? Let's say 10 years later,
I,
are we
I
going to be there?
I don't think we're getting there. I will tell you, like, for example, all of us want to be influencing school curriculum. And
Yeah.
you look at the national ways of looking at school curriculum, I can give you 10 different people coming to the same SCRT with 10 different notes on how to look at the curriculum. Now,
And believe
the,
me,
the
that's frustrating, actually.
yeah, and then how do we really pitch it at a very different level of
Yeah.
in terms of, like, uh, what is it that needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And my dream is where a time when we are able to look at these things in that reality, and that is where I see the possibility of moving ahead. And in the
Mm-hmm.
next 10 years, like, otherwise what is going to happen is, like, we are going to lose the space that is available in terms of influencing the situation.
Right.
There is because of it becomes frustrating for people to be dealing with different issues and not concerted effort, and therefore the way that we need to really jointly agree on what needs to be done. I will take one example. Like, in Karnataka 3 years ago with the commission, we were looking at an SOP on dealing with POXO, and then we had the
Okay.
police, we had the judiciary, we had everybody sit around and work on it as a single piece of work, which was a joint effort.
Right.
And
Okay.
I think if we are looking at something which needs to be done with schools, it has to be health, nutrition, education, child protection, all
Together.
these issues together,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
have a positioning which is slightly different from how we move. And that is my suggestion. Yeah.
Right. I think the reason why this question comes to my mind before I come to you, Lolly, is somewhere when I look at with a lot of publicity and fanfare, we had the right to education, getting notified more than 10 years ago. But in 2022, when you really ask what's happened to that act, I think we have put it in the dustbin almost. It's very close to that place because we have looked at it more as a scheme and not really as a fundamental right.
Right.
And this is exactly the danger that Vinod Raina, the great Vinod Raina, at that point of time was warning us against. He said, "Don't allow this to become a scheme." Uh,
Yeah.
and if you look at the Right to Education Forum's own data, I think they've stopped updating that data after 2017 or 18. Not more than 12 to 15% of the schools across the country are even meeting some of those norms. So I think this and coupled, I was jolted rudely in the last few days when we saw what the Swamiji in Karnataka has been doing, and how one has been kind of politicizing that issue, and the direction in which that has gone. The recent stalking cases, in which that girl was burnt. I think it was Jharkhand or Delhi. I don't remember.
Jharkhand.
Very, very, very rude reminders that as a society we are brutally treating our children. And I mean, these may look like isolated examples, but I think there's a lot that is happening which we need to be worried about. I mean, look at right to education. We brought back examinations again,
Hmm.
arguing that without examinations children don't learn. I think it's a very regressive step.
Oh, yeah.
Oli, your thoughts on what do you want to see 10 years down the line?
I wouldn't step into that. I think what Sony has laid out is something more than I would be happy with in the next 10 years. But I would like to bring the focus back to Sony. I will end with a little question, simple, straightforward question, Sony. I'm sure again there are many people who are listening to you to this conversation, including many child rights professionals, young budding social workers. What would you tell them in terms of, if you look at your 36 years of career, you have you had a journey and you've learned, you've mentored, you've trained people from the grassroots to higher levels. What would you tell them in terms of skills, values, attitudes? If you need to be really a good child rights professional, if you need to be a contributing social worker, what would you tell them?
Great question. Yeah.
Mm, Thank you so much for that question. In fact, the two things which I actually referred to Miss Mary Roy, somebody who was actually for me an eye opener at that time, and Dr. Parasu, for example, Tis, who passed away. It's been intense reflections these days on, like, who are the people who leave lasting impressions on you. I was
Hmm.
actually in a session yesterday, day before yesterday. TC is starting a program on urban governance in its Hyderabad campus, and they're launching that one. So I was telling them, see, I think unless you are willing to go down and soil your hands continuously, we
Hmm.
cannot live uh, on current account. You need a current account. You can't live on fixed deposits. I do something 20 years, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and most of us, what is happening is, like, we are living in the glory of work that is happened 10 or 15
Yeah.
years ago, and then
Right.
create that image and not able to get down to soiling our hands at any point in time. And
Hmm.
I believe if you are to be working with children, it shouldn't end as your field experience in the first 5 years. I go and soil my hands and then not look at children or situations again.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And we need to
I think it
continuously
happens
be.
when you look at it as a career where you feel that somewhere soiling your hands is below your dignity after a point.
Yeah,
Actually.
Yeah.
unless we are able to be constantly be
Hmm.
in that learning and being in direct touch with your realities, we are
Yeah.
not able to be making this difference.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
I believe for child rights activists, the necessity is to be getting back to children, go back to
Mm,
situations, listen to children,
mm,
and they
Right.
will tell you their reality. And I mean, like, the the kind of children. I mean, the Muzaffarpur children who were in rehabilitation program in vocational training. I've been interacting with them. I've seen them in close contact. There are people who, I mean, like, so how do you really listen to people? What are the struggles that people are having to get back on their feet? And if
Yeah.
we are not able to get to their feeling and what they have to tell us, our journeys are going to be, I would say, meaningless, because unless we are, and also be on a journey of continuous learning
Yes.
Hmm.
and never believe, like, that we have l- learned enough to be, and therefore, how do we really keep, and the realm of child rights for me, it's like, for these 20 years last, in the new millennium, the kind of changes that is happening, the kind of processes that is happening globally, nationally, on how are these things happening, what is it, how is it impacting in the field, what is happening to the field, and this is for me the bigger challenge. And also, how do I define my responsibility? Let me tell you honestly, in today's context, the the freedom I had in the last 30 years of finding resources for people who wandered with children is getting minimized,
Ah,
Shrinks.
and
Yeah.
the opportunities are getting shrunk. But then, where do I have my hope? I see an Asim Premji Foundation, I see a Tata Trust, and I believe it is my responsibility to be mentoring and facilitating work with those people, so that that tribe and that support system is there for children of this country.
Right.
And that
Right.
I need to be able to define myself and find and emerge in meaningful engagements,
Right.
which may not be exactly in the framework of your job responsibility or how do you see, but in terms of your understanding and your analysis of how things are and what we need to be, and that will make you a relevant player. And I believe in interacting regularly with budding social workers, especially people who are in the students, young students. I go and spend a lot of time there. I work with children. Even now, any opportunity to be with children directly in action, be there and
Right.
continuously look at opportunities that is emerging, and the way, finding a way ahead, I see is possible. And I am very optimistic. The situation in this country, we will be having a completely new narration of child rights, a completely new tribe of weighing, looking at child rights in this country would emerge in the near future, which would be transformative in nature. And that would come from the younger generation, not from the oldies and boldies like us, but going to be a young generation which would redefine the whole intervention and way forward. Yeah.
right, Sony. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Giri,
very
over
much. I
to you.
think
I
those
think
are
we are
very
running time.
useful, very
Yeah.
useful insights. And I think that's a very nice way to also end this beautiful conversation that we've had. 1 hour and 18 minutes is certainly not enough to, talk about things that are so complex and multi-layered. But then uh, I have learned a lot from this conversation, including the historical perspectives that you provided, Sony, and also,
Mm.
the kind of outlining of challenges and opportunities that you have, also shared with us. Loli, thank you very much for tuning in, for engaging
With
with us.
pleasure.
Yes,
Thank you so
Practice.
much.
Look forward to many more such conversations at Giriz Adda as we, get in more and more people to the Adda for some Addebazi. So, with that, let me end this over here. Thank you all for those who participated, and I'm afraid I was not able to take all the comments that you have. Uh, you have made on the chat. There is a very nice comment that has been made by JISSPL. You guys will be familiar with that. Thank you for the nice discussions. It was nice digging the various nodes we have created so far. And Arlene Manoharan says, kudos to you, Sony, for your dedicated service to children and their rights. Proud of you. So that's a very nice statement. And so thank you very much and look forward to the next session on the ADA. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Giri. Bye, everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you.
to
Thank you.
everyone
Thank
online.
you.
Thank you.